गिरिधर चरण दर्शन पियासी, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम। आने नहीं जाने, आने नहीं माने, आने नहीं जाने, आने नहीं माने, आने जाने तो कुछ काम, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम। कीर्तन रंगे नाचत मीरा, गिरिधर चरण नयन धीरा। कीर्तन रंगे नाचत मीरा, गिरिधर चरण नयन धीरा। पर्वत जंगल फलों फूलों में, पर्वत जंगल फलों फूलों में, देखत शाम वही शाम, मीरा मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम। हो गई मीरा बावरी, पुकार रहे कहो गिरिधारी। हो गई मीरा बावरी, पुकार रहे कहो गिरिधारी। मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर, मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर। कहा श्याम पुनः धाम, मीरा मीरा चले ब्रिजधाम, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम, मीरा चली ब्रिजधाम।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. This melodious song in the beautiful voice of Basudhara is about the devotion to Lord Krishna. It's a Meera bhajan. Meera was a passionate devotee of Sri Krishna, and because of an episode in her childhood, she had come to believe that Krishna was her spouse. And in the Indian bhakti tradition, that is also acceptable because we are all manifestations of the divine, and therefore the devotee can have all types of relationship with the divine. And therefore, she says that in this particular song, that she is going where her object of devotion stays, and would not care for anything else. She's completely sort of possessed by him, and may be considered by others as if she has lost her mind, but that is immaterial to her. She's going where her object of devotion is. With that, now we turn to today's topic, which is a scientific look at emotions. What it essentially means is an unemotional look at emotions. And the word scientific has been used because these days, in the era of science, somehow something, if something is scientific, it is also considered true. And emotions being something wishy-washy and subjective, if we add the word scientific, that gives some sort of a credibility even to something as slippery as and as volatile as emotions. So that is the whole idea of using the word scientific. Uh, so that's what we shall see today. The next question that arises, are emotions really necessary? Because emotions often lead us astray. We can get tempted to follow the wrong path, and therefore, many religious and traditions would have it that emotions, in fact, should be rejected. We should suppress them, we should kill them. But not so in the scheme of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, not just because emotions are, in any case, something that are very difficult to get rid of. It's not easy to eliminate emotions from our lives. But emotions are what make our lives also colorful and worth living. Further, there is a deeper reason and more important reason which Sri Aurobindo and the Mother have given why emotions should not be rejected, and that is that everything great and worthwhile in the world happens essentially because of emotions. Because all great things involve many difficulties, obstacles, and hardships, and we get ready to face all that because we are passionately involved in something. And therefore, even if it's something as dispassionate as a scientific project, a scientist gets involved in it only if he's passionately involved in finding out the truth. At least that is the ideal situation. And therefore, emotions should not be rejected. Forget about scientific projects or climbing the Everest or going to space, all of which happens essentially because of the emotional involvement of the person. The person is so intensely wanting it at the emotional level that the person is ready to go through everything, even take a risk, because it's known that those who have gone to the space or to the Everest have often died. But then yet, more and more expeditions keep going to the Everest every year. And that happens because the person is willing to take that risk because of the emotional involvement. Yeah, but forget about the great things like climbing the Everest, uh, even something very ordinary, like getting married, is something which everybody knows creates difficulties. And one looks around, finds that a lot of people are having difficulties in life essentially because of having got married, either with the spouse or with the children and so on. And uh, even getting a child admitted to a good school is such a big problem, at least in India. So when so many problems arise out of getting married, again, it is because of the emotions that most people do end up getting married and having children. And that is something which is essential and worthwhile. It may not be considered great, a great achievement, but then all the same, it is essential and worthwhile. And that is why nature has overloaded us with this passion, which makes almost everybody go in for this particular path of getting married and having children, in spite of knowing all the pitfalls involved. There is a story of a supercomputer which could answer every question. And the scientists who had made it were giving a demonstration and said that this is a supercomputer and it can answer any question you like. So ask any difficult question you like, and this computer will be able to answer. So people started thinking of which difficult question to ask. Everybody, was struggling with the most difficult question to ask to test the computer. But one child got up and just asked a question: "How do you feel about being a supercomputer?" After a considerable pause, came a reply from the supercomputer: "I don't know what to feel means." So feelings are something which are something which are not only, of course, I will not say only human. Animals also do feel. We can relate to the joy and sorrow of a dog or a cat, but it's only living beings, uh, animals and man, who feel. Computers don't feel. So even a supercomputer could not feel. So feelings are something which are some associated with any living being, and that is what distinguishes us from machines like computers. Evolutionary, from the evolutionary point of view, emotions are primitive as compared to the capacity to think. If we look at the evolution of the nervous system, we find that initially it was just a reflex mechanism. Without knowing and without feeling, the animal was able to find food and uh, reproduce and so on. So that is essentially what the primitive animals even continue to do. But then in the course of evolution, in order to make more possibilities, create more possibilities, the head end distinguished itself from the tail end, and much of the sensory organs, like the eyes and the ears and the tongue, they got the nose, they got concentrated at the head end, so that as an animal is advancing, it is able to sense food and danger uh, more easily and take appropriate action. Now, this was the distinction between the head and the tail. Then, at the head end, to create more possibilities, the set of nerve cells at the head end started growing. And within this were located those centers which could regulate essential functions like the cardiac function and respiratory function, uh, so that these could keep pace with the requirements of the body. So the integration of all the information that was coming, so that the heart and the respiratory system could change their activity accordingly, was located at the top of this structure. The top of the spinal cord was an enlargement, which we call the brainstem. So first it was a linear thing, the spinal cord, and at the head end got a little enlargement, which had the centers for regulating essential functions like the uh, heart beating of the heart and respiratory system, and that continues to be so even in human beings. So that has continued all the way. However, with further evolution, at the level of the reptiles, what happened was that this was covered with another layer of another neural structure, which made it possible for the animal to feel. So the essential functions for survival were evolved first, and then followed the emotions at the level of the reptiles. And one can understand why that happened, because that is what creates, in addition to the capacity to live, the urge to live. Even the primitive animal, which had everything located in the brainstem, had the capacity to live, but it did not have a strong urge to live because the feelings were lacking. And this was important because this created in the animal a motivation for looking for things which will make it survive or make the species survive. And, uh, and therefore, these were linked to feelings. For example, if an animal is hungry, it is miserable, and it knows that if I find food, I'll be happy. So it escaped to escape the misery of hunger, and in anticipation of the pleasure that it will get from food and the relief from this misery that it will get when it eats, it was motivated to look for food. So this created a motivation for essential functions like food and sex by linking these to emotions. And after this, this was covered with a neural structure which took care of feelings. Then, came another layer on top of it, which was concerned with thinking. And this we find pretty well developed in the mammals, and still better developed in the primates, that is monkey-like animals. And the best developed so far is in human beings. And this is what we call the cerebral cortex. But then these could not be divorced from the other functions. And therefore, there are rich connections between this primitive part, which deals with the survival, and the part that deals with the emotions, and the part which deals with thinking. So there are rich to and fro connections between all these parts. And one can understand why that is important, because while we can understand that the essential functions of survival, like eating and uh, finding a mate, have emotional counterparts, so that has to be linked to the emotions. But then thinking also is concerned with that, because that is what makes the animal make more reasoned and uh, better choices in while looking for food or while escaping from danger. So some sort of a crude reasoning we find even in animals who have a cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex has been growing, and we find that how intelligently sometimes animals such as horses or elephants can actually act, and dolphins of course are extremely smart. So that is because of the well developed cerebral cortex. But then there are interconnections between all these parts of the being, and this is one way of looking at it. Of course, it doesn't mean that uh, in terms of biological evolution, what it would just mean is that it somehow accidentally happened. Some change happened de novo, out of the blue, and then since it was useful for survival, it continued to persist in the creatures that evolved after that. But then that is a little difficult. It involves a somehow which science does not know. From the spiritual angle, that difficulty does not arise because, spiritually speaking, all creation, including non living matter, is a manifestation of the divine. It's the divine itself in another form. And therefore, it carries in it all the possibilities for further evolution, right up to a creature which will have a consciousness quite comparable to the consciousness of the Supreme or the divine itself. That has not yet happened, at least not on a large scale, but all the same, that possibility exists, which means that the possibility of life uh, already already existed in dead matter, and the possibility for having a mind already existed in creatures which just had life but no mind, and the possibilities of an intellect existed in the animals which only had a primitive mind which could only feel. So all these possibilities were there, and if the trend in evolution is any indication, man is not the final product of evolution because he is far far away from manifesting the full consciousness of what is hidden inside in the form of our divine essence, the soul. However, man has one peculiarity which other animals don't share. Of course, from the scientific point of view, some of the peculiarities of man are that only man can speak, use language effectively. Other creatures have to depend upon a very limited modulation of voice or gestures. Only human beings have developed languages. The other important thing from the logical or scientific point of view, which distinguishes man, is cerebral asymmetry. That is, some of the functions which need not be present on both sides have been located predominantly either on the right or on the left side of the brain. And that creates sort of that spares space. For example, functions like, say, music or art or logic and mathematics don't have to be located on both sides. They do not require a bilateral representation, like the control of the muscles requires. And therefore, we find that there is a division, music and art more on the right side, and logic and mathematics more on the left side of the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that evolved the last. So that is from the biological point of view, sorry, from the spiritual point of view. From the spiritual point of view, what has been happening is that when there was that evolutionary thrust, which was a part of the divine design, then it required a structure which could channelize a greater fraction of that hidden consciousness. So that is how the brain kept evolving into a more complex structure. For example, if in addition to feelings, thinking had also to come in, then it required a more um, uh, complicated, bigger structure. And that is how the cortex developed, because in addition to feelings, now this structure now had the capacity to think. And if this capacity to think had to develop further, this structure had to become bigger. And the result is that in human beings, we find that although all these structures are there as in animals, but the cerebral cortex has grown so big that the part that deals with emotions is hidden deep inside. If you cut the brain, say, along its uh, with this plane, you find that you don't even see the structures concerned with emotions. Because what you see instead is that structure which connects the two sides of the cerebral cortex. It's only when you go a little on this side, a little on this side, that buried deep within is a relatively small structure which deals with emotions. In contrast, in the reptilian brain, you find that that constitutes almost the entire brain, and it's very highly visible, and there's only a very thin layer of the cortex. So that is how a more and more complex brain made it possible to express a higher fraction, a greater fraction of the hidden consciousness of the divine. So that is the spiritual way of looking at it. So nothing was created de novo. It's only the possibilities which were hidden even in dead matter kept unfolding bit by bit, because creation of matter was in a way a great fall. Just imagine the all-knowing, all-powerful divine becoming something like dead matter, which seems to know nothing and can do nothing. And after this gross involution, started the opposite process, evolution, which essentially meant revealing step by step a little more of the hidden consciousness. And that is how uh, came life and then mind. And to make all that possible, a more complicated physical structure was necessary. So, what the brain has been doing as it has been growing more and more complicated, satisfying the need for expressing a greater fraction of the hidden consciousness. So that is the spiritual way of looking at it. It didn't happen accidentally. Somehow it happened. That is not what we say from the spiritual point of view, because the possibility was already there, and the evolutionary thrust is a part of the divine design for taking the journey further, so that this cycle will culminate, this progression will culminate in a creature which will uh, have expressed even a far greater fraction of the consciousness than human beings. But human beings, from the spiritual point of view, from the scientific point of view, we saw that the human beings are unique in having speech and in having cerebral asymmetry. From the spiritual point of view, the uniqueness of man is that not only it is likely to evolve further because of the inevitable thrust of the evolutionary force, the human being has an urge to evolve, and therefore it will want to evolve. It has that motivation. And further, it also has the capacity to evolve. And one can make the best use of this capacity by following the spiritual path or the path of yoga. That is what yoga, which in practice, which is sort of in practice, the spiritual path. Uh, so that is how one can actually evolve. And select few are able to evolve to an extent that their consciousness matches that of, expresses almost the entire supreme consciousness. These are our rishis and mystics. And so it is possible, and a select few have been able to do it. We'll not dwell further on this. Instead, I will go now to the presentation itself. So we'll now have a scientific look at emotions. This session is a part of the Yes.03 course, which in turn is a part of the Yes project, which in turn celebrates the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. My gratitude to Tortora and Grabowski for creating this wonderful book, Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, from which have been taken the realistic looking anatomical pictures in the presentation. So this, for recapitulation, here is the brain, and we find that deep here is the hypothalamus. Now, this hypothalamus is an extremely important structure because it funnels everything that comes from the cortex and the part dealing with emotions. The part that deals with emotions is what we call the limbic system. So all those influences converge on the hypothalamus, and from here they radiate to the brainstem and the spinal cord to influence a wide variety of functions. This shows the limbic system a little more clearly. So if instead of uh, looking at it strictly from midline, which shows only this part connecting the left and the right brain, if you go a little to the side, one finds that we have this structure, which is the physical foundation, the physical structure that makes it possible for us to channelize that aspect of consciousness which we recognize as emotions. And it's called the limbic system. It has nothing to do with limbs. It's called limbic because limbus also means a girdle or a belt. Since it looks like a girdle or a belt, it has been called the limbic system. Now, this shows a little further simplified view of the limbic system, and some of the major structures have been labeled here. Uh, Amygdala is an important part of the limbic system. and so is hippocampus. Hippocampus deals with memory, and emotions and memory are closely related. If we have any strong emotions, that is stored in the memory the best. And this is the uh, hypothalamus here, and it's called hypothalamus because it is just below this structure which is called the thalamus. Thalamus is a part of the midbrain which receives all sensory input from the body. It's a relay station. Before it goes to the relays it further to the cerebral cortex. And one can understand why it is so close and why so richly connected to the limbic system, because the starting point of any feeling is generally a stimulus, a sensory stimulus. Of course, we can generate emotions even without that. We can close our eyes and think of something which happened in the past, which was very pleasant, and we can relive that pleasant experience. There's no stimulus involved here. But that is because it has been stored in the memory here in the hippocampus. But all the same, by and large, our emotions depend upon sensory inputs, and that's how we find that. That's why we find that there are rich connections and geographical proximity between the thalamus and the limbic system. For that, directly, cerebral cortical involvement may not be necessary because one can feel uh, from the sensory stimulus without necessarily becoming fully aware of the sensory stimulus. And a detailed analysis of that sensory stimulus, which will take place in the cerebral cortex, is not necessary, and therefore feelings may sometimes, in fact, anticipate or precede the full appreciation of the sensory stimulus. Now let's come to the physical manifestations of the emotions. Emotions express themselves quite often as an increase in the heart rate or increase in the respiratory rate. So an emotion like fear or anxiety or uh, agitation. Now, these can show up as an increase in the heart rate, increase in the respiratory rate. Now, the question has been raised, which of these is the cause and which is the effect? Is it that because of reflex involuntary mechanisms and uh, a stimulus which we are afraid of raises the heart rate and so on, the heart starts pounding, and it is the pounding of the heart that leads to the emotion of fear? Or is it that the fear comes first when we see the object, at once we are afraid, and then that in turn raises the heart rate? So, which is the cause and which is the effect? And there have been theories which support one or the other, but then, as usual, the truth lies between the two. Both are possible. Uh, a stimulus which creates fear, say, for example, uh, a little deer or a rabbit, when it faces a lion, it is afraid. And this fear comes first, and then that in turn raises the heart rate, etc., which makes it possible also for the animal to cope with this fear better because it will have to run, and running is an exercise which will require all these things to supply additional blood uh, to the muscles which are exercising, to carry extra oxygen and remove extra carbon dioxide that will be produced there. So all this will be necessary. And so it is the fear which leads to those bodily changes, those physical manifestations, which make it easier for the animal to cope with that fear. The other way around is also true if we increase the heart rate by some other means. For example, we inject adrenaline in a person. We just give him a shot of adrenaline that raises the heart rate. And we find that the person still becomes anxious or agitated. He feels his peace of mind is gone just by an injection of adrenaline. There is no other stimulus. It's only an injection after all. All injections don't do that. But an injection which raises the heart rate does creates a certain amount of anxiety and uh, sometimes fear and agitation in the person. Now, therefore, one might say that it is these physical manifestations like the hormonal changes which are responsible for the emotions. Um, so both are possible, but all the same, one can look upon the type of anxiety and fear which comes from mere injection of adrenaline. It is more like referred pain. The body has learned through experience normally associate this type of physical manifestation with certain emotions. And therefore, if we create only those physical manifestations in isolation, still is interpreted as an emotion because that is what the body has got accustomed to, conditioned to. And therefore, by and large, it would appear as if the emotion is primary and that is the cause, and the effect are the various physical manifestations. And in that, the limbic system and the hypothalamus have an important role to play. Now let's come to this great structure, the hypothalamus. It's a tiny little part of the brain weighing just 10 grams. And we'll just look at the wide range of functions it has. And that is possible, it acts as a sort of a funnel. This is the cerebral cortex, the part which makes thinking and reasoning possible. These are the structures below the cortex, subcortical structures, which would include the thalamus, the limbic system, and everything in the brainstem, which is the primitive part, regulating the beating of the heart and the respiratory function and the movements and secretions of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, all these are controlled to some extent from the brainstem, although the higher influences also affect them. And all these influences are being funneled to the hypothalamus. And that in turn leads to all those changes in the body, hormonal changes, other physical changes, which are channeled through various hormones and the autonomic nervous system to give us all those physical manifestations of the uh, input from the thinking part or the feeling part of the brain. And of course, here for simplicity, only a one-way traffic has been shown. It is not really a one-way traffic. Everything is traveling also in the opposite direction. So the sensory stimuli going from here are being processed here to create a certain sort of a environment here in these neural structures, which in turn is interpreted when all this input is put together, that the body needs more oxygen, or that there's an object which creates fear, or uh, as a result of any stimulus, or otherwise the person is thinking of doing something, and that also gets funneled here. So all these are, this is a uh, complex network here in which there are rich to and fro connections. Uh, the brain has about 10 raised to the power 11 nerve cells, and on an average, each cell has 1,000 connections. And one can understand 10 raised to the power 14 connections, rich connections in this area, which not only are there, they are also not absolutely stable in the sense that they can multiply, they can grow. They'll grow in the part of the brain which is used more. This is what we call neuroplasticity. So the part of the brain that we use more will develop richer connections. And probably there'll be an occasion when we'll talk more about this neuroplasticity. But let's return to the hypothalamus, which has these wide range of functions. It regulates the autonomic nervous system, which in turn affects all those functions which are not under the control of willpower, like the heart and the respiratory system and the gastrointestinal secretions and motility, etc. Then endocrine control, it affects the endocrine secretions of the pituitary. Uh, Posterior pituitary hormones are, of course, made in the hypothalamus itself and only stored in the posterior pituitary. And these hormones are ADH and oxytocin. And there are other hormones for which the hypothalamus has releasing hormones. So it can release those hormones, which in turn will release hormones like the thyroid hormone or the uh, corticosteroids. So from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and from the anterior pituitary to the endocrine organ, that is the sort of chain for endocrine control in the anterior pituitary. Releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, a trophic hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then that in turn affects the activity of the endocrine gland like thyroid or the adrenals. Then temperature regulation. When we are exposed to a hot environment, the body responds by raising the uh, by stimulating those mechanisms which will increase heat dissipation and loss of heat. Heat dissipation increases because the blood flow to the skin increases. The skin gets warmer, it radiates more heat to the surroundings. And heat loss increases primarily because of sweating, because as the sweat evaporates, it takes heat from the body. Evaporation requires heat, and the body gets cooled since the heat is lost from the body in the process of the drying up or evaporation of the sweat. Then food intake regulation. There are areas within the hypothalamus which, based on all the inputs which are coming from it, uh, especially from say areas like the stomach, which when it is distended, but also from many other sources, all this information put together tells the hypothalamus that now enough has been eaten. When that happens, uh, an area in the hypothalamus gets activated, which is called the satiety center. And that leads to a feeling of satisfaction with the food. I don't need to eat anymore. And the person decides not to eat, which means that it is regulated here and then it is conveyed to the cortex, which is our conscious center for area for conscious actions. So consciously we know I have eaten enough. I do not need to eat anymore. And then based on that, we take actions which will start from the cortex and go down so that when we are full, we'll actually stop eating. Then, in the opposite situation, when the person is hungry, then this satiety center becomes quiet. When another neighboring area, which we call the hunger center, that gets activated, and that will create a feeling of hunger and also physical manifestations like the pangs of the stomach pangs. So food is also regulated from, food intake is regulated from here. Then water balance, that's also regulated from here by creating thirst uh, when we are uh, uh, when we are deficient in water, and also uh, by regulating the secretion of ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, which reduces the amount of urine formed. So if we can increase or reduce the rate of urine formation to achieve water balance. Closely related to water balance is balance of the salts or electrolytes. For that, again, the hypothalamus, that also the hypothalamus does, partly through ADH itself, but also through aldosterone, another hormone of the adrenal cortex. So water balance is located here, but that's not all. It regulates body temperature, it regulates food intake, water balance that we have seen, and reproduction. Uh, reproduction by affecting the function of the ovaries and the testes. And we have seen how that happens through the uh, GnRH, that is the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which in turn affects the hormones of the ovaries and the testes. It also has a role to play in sleep. We shall talk a little more in detail about sleep in one of the subsequent sessions. And then it deals with circadian rhythms, that is, rhythms which have a roughly 24-hour periodicity. This is linked to the light dark cycle. But then, even if the light dark stimulus is removed, the person is in a situation where the light and dark do not change, or they change in the opposite direction. During the day, the person is exposed to darkness, and during night, the person is exposed to light. We find that in all these situations, a certain periodicity of roughly 24 hours is maintained. For example, a blind person, he also has this 24-hour periodicity. It becomes more accurate when light and dark cycle is normal. But even in the absence of that, the hypothalamus itself has a circadian rhythm. Now, why is this type of rhythmic activity of roughly 24 hours at a time, a 24-hour cycle, why has it been built into the hypothalamus? And that has been built into the hypothalamus because uh, it helps in establishing a certain routine which will help the animal function better. So things like sleep or food intake, now these, if they have a certain periodicity which is linked to the light dark cycle, it helps the person establish a certain routine. And then, of course, more relevant to what we are talking about today, that is emotions, hypothalamus is the place from where we get all the expression of emotions through all types of physical uh, changes, some of them not at a conscious level, like the change in the heart rate or the breathing rate or the change in the gastrointestinal activity or the urinary bladder activity. But then emotions are expressed also through changes in voluntary musculature. For example, if an animal, when it is angry, bares its teeth, it unfurls its claws, and so on. So those physical changes which are brought about by skeletal muscles, muscles which are under the control of willpower. Here, irrespective of the willpower, even without using that willpower, those muscles start acting. And in human beings, we find that there is a great deal of expression of emotions in the face area and to some extent in the head and neck area. So when we are under stress, our stresses and strains accumulate by and large in the face and in the head and neck area. And that is how it shows on the face. We can read from the person's face whether the person is happy or unhappy. And also, uh, apart from the face, the neck muscles may get tense, and when the person is under stress, and continuous contraction of some of the muscles in the neck and this um, in the temporal area, here, uh, that may lead to a tension headache. So there can be physical changes involving skeletal muscles and also purely autonomic functions like the heart and the stomach and the lungs, etc. All those expressions are channeled through the hypothalamus. So why have been so many functions concentrated in this tiny 10-gram structure, the hypothalamus? Because we need an integrating center. All these functions which the hypothalamus has uh, cannot function in isolation. They have to be integrated. So there has to be an integrating center which can receive all types of inputs from below, that is from the spinal cord up, and from above, from the cerebral cortex down, integrate all that, and then come to a decision as to what is to be done to the autonomic functions like the heart and the lungs and so on, and what is to be done with respect to skeletal muscles, whether the animal has to run or at least, it starts showing in the expression of the face. Now, here is how emotional expression makes itself felt. Uh, this is a real smile and this is a fake smile. We can fake a smile, but then a real smile is different from fake smile, and the difference lies primarily in the eyes. In a real smile, the corners of the mouth go up and the cheeks become more prominent because of, these are muscles which are voluntary, which means that they are under the control of willpower. But when we smile naturally, then the willpower is not involved, just happens. So these voluntary muscles can also have an involuntary control, which originates basically in our mind. When we are happy, then that happens. But along with that, we also find that there is a puckering of the eyes. That is because of the contraction of a muscle around the eyes. In a fake smile, voluntarily we can take the corners of the mouth up, make the cheeks prominent, but we cannot pucker our eyes because this muscle is which is not under the control of willpower. So that is how one way in which you can make out a real smile from a fake smile. But there are a few rare people whose fake smile also resembles a real smile. They have voluntary control also of this muscle. And these are the people who sometimes make the most successful actors and actresses. Now we come to an interesting question, whether on the whole it is better to be emotional or rational. The classical teaching is that we should not get carried away by feelings. Use your head. That is what we are told. And that is because it is considered that emotions can tempt us to walk the wrong path. They can uh, waste our time. They can make us do immoral and unethical things. And therefore, emotions can get us into trouble. And emotions are something which seem almost dispensable, although they are not. But all the same, the general feeling is that there's a common feeling that emotions lead us astray. And therefore, even if we have the emotions, they should be governed or tempered by the rational part of the mind, thinking part of the mind, which reasons. Now, does it have to be an either or situation? Can't both be used effectively to live the best possible life? That is the question that arises. Why do we have to choose between the two? If both have been planted in us, there must be a purpose behind it. And from what we have spoken so far, there seemed to be a purpose, at least to the emotions, a great purpose to the emotions. And it is not difficult for us, human beings who have well developed uh, intellect, that even the rational part of the mind is of great importance in everyday life. So why can't it be both? And this is something that can be understood from this example. a well-known example of Phineas Gage, an American who worked on the railroad tracks. He was about 25 years of age when he was the victim of an accident. They were blowing up certain rocks, etc., to clear the path for a railway track. And what he did was, at the tip of a steel rod, he placed some explosives, and they were to be timed to go off after he had moved away from that rod. But then, as a result of an accident, what happened was that it blew off before he could move away from there, and this 1 meter rod, uh, which was about 3 centimeters in diameter, and even at the sharp tip was about half a centimeter in diameter, went through his cheek and came out at the other side of the head and went and fell a few meters away from where he was, all the way through. But then, interestingly, what happened was that within a few minutes, he could talk and walk to the doctor and tell him the story of what had happened. And since he appeared otherwise completely all right, he was treated only with uh, antiseptic dressing, and the wound healed, and apparently he looked completely normal. But only apparently. His personality underwent a change. What happened was that after this accident, he retained the capacity to think, but lost the capacity to feel. And the result was that he started getting into trouble. He kept losing one job after another. Of course, he found jobs which only people like him could get. He became sort of an exhibit, and started participating in circuses where he could be demonstrated. Uh, but all the same, uh, his capacity to uh, think was intact, but his capacity to feel was lost, and that what got him into trouble. And how did that happen? Can't we live using only the intellect? That is something which has been sort of gone into in some detail by a person called Antonio Damasio, and he's published a book which in which this episode occupies a very large fraction of the book, Descartes' Error. Uh, Antonio Damasio and his wife Hannah, they have gone into this, and Hannah is a radiologist. So what she has done is these X-ray, these studies of the skull, uh, and to trace the path and all have been done by her. Now they have come up with a hypothesis, and their hypothesis is that normally when we get a stimulus, then we uh, use the intellect to calculate what the consequences of different courses of action could be. So there's a stimulus, and that stimulus asks for some action, and we think of a few alternative courses of action. So we have a few options available, and using these, and then we evaluate these consequences. Sorry, we have a few options available. Then we use our intellect to calculate what the consequences of these options would be. Then what we do is we evaluate the consequences emotionally. Some of these consequences could be pleasant and some could be unpleasant. We choose the action which would be pleasant and not unpleasant. The intellect also helps us decide whether the consequences may be pleasant, but will they be ethical? Will the course of action would be ethical? So we try to choose an option, the consequences of which will be pleasant and which will be ethical. So, which means that the emotional part of the being and the intellect are working together. It is the intellect which comes up with various options. It is the intellect which calculates the various options, so with the consequences of various options. And but then these options are evaluated emotionally. So that is where the emotions enter. We work out which of these consequences will be pleasant and which will be unpleasant, and we choose the uh, actions which would have pleasant consequences, which will also be at the same time ethical. Now, what about a person like Phineas Gage, who lost the capacity to feel? If there's a stimulus, then he has an intellect which is still intact. So he will also come up with various options. But because He'll come up with various options and he'll use his intellect to work out the consequences of different options. That much he'll do like any other normal person. But then he has lost the capacity to feel. So he will not be able to evaluate the consequences emotionally. He knows the consequences, but he can't evaluate them emotionally. So instead of choosing those actions which will lead to pleasant consequences, pleasant and ethical consequences, he will end up choosing at random. And he end up choosing options which get him into trouble. For example, he may uh, rub everybody on the wrong side. He may be unduly rude. And the result is that he will suffer in his relationships. He may keep losing one job after another. And that is what happened to this person. And he eventually died at the age of about 38. He had this accident at the age of 25. Another 13 years later, he was gone. Now, Demisio's hypothesis is that this happened because although his capacity to think was intact, he had lost the capacity to feel. But then reports are this is an exaggeration. To some extent, he had also picked up the capacity to feel, and at the end of his life, he was not as unsocial as one might think. And one of the things helped him was that he became a coachman in Chile. He moved out of the US and went to Chile, and where he became a coachman, giving a certain structure to his life, having a daily routine, and doing a job, and dealing with people who got into the coach helped him recover some of his capacity also to feel, and he was doing quite well. Uh, So initially he did have problems because of losing the capacity to feel, but eventually some of it came back. Now, how did it come back? That again happens because of the plasticity in the brain. Because when some structure is destroyed, then the neighboring parts of the brain tend to take over some of that function which has been lost because of this damage. Now, this is the hypothesis, Demasio's hypothesis. There is a stimulus, and we use the capacity to reason to work out the various courses of action available to us. Option 1, option 2, option 3, and option 4. Then again, we use reasoning, the intellect, to find out the consequences of these 4 options. This action is ethical and rewarding. This action is unethical. Ethical and unethical would be at the level of the intellect. Rewarding, that, and it could also be at the level of the intellect. But the emotional evaluation will interpret a reward as pleasant and a punishment as unpleasant. So the consequences could be rewarding and therefore pleasant, but the action is ethical. The consequences could be rewarding and but the action is unethical, therefore the consequences could be unpleasant. The uh, action carries neither reward nor punishment, so when evaluated emotionally, the person is indifferent to it. The consequences are unpleasant, they involve a punishment, and therefore this is unpleasant. So the person chooses the action which is ethical and rewarding, and then uses his reasoning to actually carry out option 1. So this is his hypothesis. Now, what we have seen so far suggests that if we have both the capacity to feel and the capacity to reason, we will make the best choices. So, is the combination of emotions and reason necessarily the best? That is the next question that arises. From a spiritual angle, actually, it is not. And what we saw here as ethical and unethical and sort of created this whole structure which seems complete in itself is not as simple as that, because although at the level of the intellect we can feel what is ethical and unethical, uh, we do not necessarily always choose what is right or what is ethical. And that is because the temptation to take a little risk may seem worth it. Uh, Say, for example, if a person has a very high income, and if he reveals all that income, then he has to pay a lot of income tax. Now he feels that can there be a way of hiding some of my income and paying less tax? His chartered accountant tells him, yes, it is possible, there are certain ways which I can teach you. I'll do it for you. It can be done. Now, this he knows is unethical, but that the temptation is very high, and therefore he vacillates whether to do it or not. And then the chartered accountant tells him, when he shows this vacillation to the chartered accountant, expresses it to the chartered accountant, he says, "Don't worry, nothing will happen. I'll do it very safely. Everybody does it." And this person feels a little assured. Then he starts using his reasoning in another way. He says, well, uh, everybody does it, so I can also do it. And moreover, if I pay more income tax, it will go to the government. The government, in any case, has a lot of money. The government also wastes a lot of money. If I save this money, I can give it away in charity. That would be much better than giving it away to the government. Now he has also found an apparently ethical looking argument that I'll give it away in charity. Actually, he may give away nothing or only a small fraction of what he saves. But at least he has found an ethical looking reason for doing what he is going to do. Now, suppose as a result of what the encouragement for the chartered accountant and this type of reasoning, I'll give it away in charity, he actually ends up doing what is in a sense still unethical, but rewarding. He ends up choosing this option of paying less income tax. Now, what happens is, although he has convinced himself with all the arguments which he got from the chartered accountant and the argument that he invented for himself, in spite of that, is he really at peace? He still loses his mental peace because off and on he keeps feeling that, well, maybe I may be caught. That nobody can give him that 100% guarantee that it will not happen. Now, if he had used reason to convince himself, then why is he feeling this uneasiness? He's feeling this uneasiness because a certain part of the brain, a certain part of his mind, or whatever you may like to call it, which does not give up and persists and keeps creating that recurring uneasiness, recurrent uneasiness, and a sense of guilt. Now, which is that part of him which is doing that? On the other hand, suppose he chooses this, he tells the chartered accountant, and if the chartered accountant tells him you can save some tax, he tells him, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to save tax. I want to do the right thing. I'll pay as much as income tax as to be paid. Suppose he chooses this. Then instead of feeling guilty and having that recurrent uneasiness, what does he get? He gets a sense of joy. I've done the right thing. And he gets a lot of peace of mind. I've done the right thing, so I don't have to worry. He gets peace of mind. Now, which is this part which makes him lose money? Which part of the being which tells him that you do this so that you may lose money, but you get joy and lasting mental peace? And if you do not listen to it, you'll get a sense of guilt and recurrent uneasiness. That part is neither the emotional part of the being nor the intellect. That is our divine essence, the soul. And the soul has a dynamic aspect which puts in its word in a faint but extremely clear voice, telling us what is right and wrong. And we can anticipate that if we listen to this voice, we'll get that joy and lasting mental peace. And also, if we don't listen to it, we'll get this sense of guilt and recurrent uneasiness. But this is a part that does not insist. And therefore, we are free to neglect it. And if we neglect it, going by the intellectual arguments that we had for doing something wrong, then we can neglect it, but then it keeps coming up in a recurring manner again and again, unless the person has been doing such things so often that this part has gone to sleep. So we have a part of the being that does better than even the combinations of emotions and reason. But then does that work in isolation? Even this part does not work in isolation because everything gets filtered through the mind. And therefore, what happens is that for that split moment, when the person decides, I'll pay full income tax, I will do the right thing, what has happened is that his emotions and intellect, his feelings and the capacity to reason, they both agreed that it may feel pleasant to save money, it may appear quite safe to save money, but then this voice is what is going to give true happiness, better than the happiness I'll get from the reward of saving some money. And it is this voice which will be foolproof, which can give a guarantee of total safety. Now, which means that for that moment, when that person has made that decision that I will do the right thing, his emotions as his intellect are in agreement with the psychic being. So the three have become one. And this unification may not last forever, but at least at that moment, he's convinced that this joy will be greater than the joy of or the pleasure of saving money. And the this will be a much safer thing than the other thing for which I have several arguments available. For this, there may be no real argument available, but all the same, I know somewhere deep within this will be the safest thing to do. Which means that uh, one of the characteristics of the psychic being and the emotions, which is common to both, is that the psychic being does not work on the basis of reason. Since it knows everything, it does not require the crutch of reasoning. So it doesn't work on the basis of reason. Emotions also do not work on the basis of reason. I feel like doing it. I feel like saving this money. So it's just a feeling. So emotions also have no proper reason. So both are non-rational parts of the being. Intellect is the rational part, but because it can give us arguments for paying the income tax and arguments for not paying the income tax, it can give us both types of arguments. For paying the income tax, that is the safest thing to do. Not paying, or of course, other arguments can be also there that after all, as a taxpayer, it is my obligation to give. If everybody decides to hide income tax, to pay less income tax, then the government's revenues will go down. How will the government be able to help those who are underprivileged? And so on and so forth. How will the government be able to engage in various projects which are for the welfare of people? So all those are also arguments for paying the income tax at the level of the intellect. And also we have seen arguments for not paying the income tax at the level of the intellect. So the intellect is vacillating. It can give us arguments for doing something and it can give us arguments for not doing something. It never leads us to a definitive conclusion. So if the emotions can go astray and take us in the wrong path because of various temptations, and the intellect does not help us really decide well because it can come up with arguments for doing something and for not doing something, then we have to naturally think of some part of the being which does not have this type of a limitation, something higher than the intellect. And that is what this psychic being, the dynamic aspect of the divine essence or the soul is. This is higher than the intellect. So it is not rational, but it is higher than the intellect. So it is non rational. Emotions are also non rational. But emotions are one notch below the intellect because it, some of the temptations, if the intellect is used properly, can be overcome by just using the intellect. The intellect can give us arguments like this is the only thing which is 100% safe. Money paid to the government is not a waste, it is required. All those arguments. So the intellect can give us arguments which support what is right, but then that is not the way the intellect is used most often. Because what happens is that these temptations can be so overpowering, emotions are so compelling that we end up inventing those arguments which will support what we want at the emotional level, even if it is wrong. So it means that instead of the intellect moderating the emotions end up exploiting the intellect. And what this exploitation means is that the emotions compel the intellect to invent, to fabricate those reasons which will support what we in any case are feeling like doing. And therefore, this part which is supposed to save us through reasoning, unable to do so because of something which is lower than it in terms of the level of functioning. Emotions are non-rational and they are at a level lower than the intellect because the intellect is capable of saving us, but the emotions are overpowering, but they are not at a level higher than the intellect. They evolved before the intellect. So the emotions are a non-rational part of the being, which is below the rational part of the being. So in that sense, emotions are not only non-rational, they are sub-rational or infra-rational. On the other hand, the psychic being is also non-rational. It just tells us this is the right thing to do, period. Doesn't go into any arguments. That crutch of reasoning is not required for an entity which knows everything. And therefore, the psychic being is also non-rational. But it is one notch above the intellect, and therefore it is non-rational and supra-rational. So whatever is non-rational can be either supra-rational or infra-rational. Emotions are infra-rational, the psychic being is supra-rational. And therefore, the combination of emotions and reason is not necessarily the best. We have something higher than the intellect, higher than the capacity to reason, which is non-rational, but at a level higher than the intellect, and that is that inner voice, the voice of the deepest self, the voice of the psychic being, call it by whatever name you like, but then it is this which is at a level higher than the intellect and can give us the best guidance. And this is what sort of we get when we look at the human mind from an integral perspective, that is, from a total perspective, from the point of view of the totality of the person. And this is sort of the conclusion we come to, that uh, we this is the part of the being around which our activities of the body, mind, and intellect should revolve, which means that we should let our body, mind, and intellect be enlightened, illumined by this inner light, which is always there, but often hidden and neglected. But all the same, if we bring it forth, if we bring it forwards, it will speak more loudly, and it will speak more habitually, and will guide us at the opportune moments about what is to be done and what is not to be done. Now that leads to another question. What the lasting mental peace which one gets by listening to the voice of the psychic being is one aspect of the lasting mental peace or equanimity, which this will give us. But there are also other aspects of equanimity. For example, one is going through difficult times, misfortune, some traumatic event. Even in that, a person on the yogic path can maintain equanimity. The Gita says, samatvam yoga uchyate. Samatvam is treating joy and sorrow, victory and defeat with equal delight, treating them with equal delight, treating them as equal. That gives us yogic equanimity. Now, how does that compare with the flat emotions of the type that Phineas Gage got? He also lost the capacity to feel. His emotions were flat. And it happens to lots of patients as well as some people on drugs, etc., certain drugs. All that can give flat emotions. So how do the two compare? What is the difference between the two? The difference between the two is that just as a person with flat emotions can make wrong choices, the way Phineas Gage did, because he could not evaluate the various options emotionally, and therefore he ended up making choices which landed him in trouble. So he may make choices which are irrational, unreasonable, and so on. The person with yogic equanimity also makes some choices which are not rational, because the person is not working at the level of the intellect, the person is working at a higher level. For example, suppose a person uh, gives away his savings in charity. Now, people would say that you are stupid. Huh? Or he gives up the offer of a lucrative job. Or he gives up a lucrative job, or he has an offer and he doesn't take it up. Now, people will tell him you are stupid. Huh? So, because he has not used his intellect the way it is normally done. Normal way of using the intellect is that we go into a profit and loss analysis, a risk and benefit analysis, and end up doing, if we are guided only by the intellect, what on the whole appears to be most profitable and least risky. On the whole, because if the profit is great, we are willing to take a certain amount of risk. So we balance the two. So on the whole, most profitable and least risky. So that is the intellectual way of working. But then this person and this person are not doing that. So this person is also making certain choices which may appear irrational and stupid to a person who is well-wisher, but is trying to guide him on the basis of the intellect. So the two look apparently similar. But there is a difference. The difference is that the person with flat emotions, because of a damage to the brain, and the damage to the brain is in the frontal lobe, that is in the cerebral cortex, the frontmost part of the cerebral cortex. That is what leads to flat emotions. So this person not only does not have feelings, but he also has lost the capacity to feel. Whereas this person does not have feelings because the person is operating at a level higher than both feeling and reason, but this person has not lost the capacity to feel. That is the difference. So this person has not lost the capacity to feel. In fact, he's feeling a sense of greater joy than from choices made at the level of the intellect. And therefore, he is capable of experiencing that joy. He has not lost the capacity to feel. This person has lost the capacity to feel. That is the difference between the two. And therefore, emotions don't really have to be rejected. Emotions just have to be purified and refined and educated so that they are used properly. And that is possible if we make the emotions work in light of our divine essence, the soul. And that is what gives us yogic equanimity. So, without losing the capacity to feel. Now, but all the same, if the person has this yogic equanimity, the person does not display much emotion. Is there any emotion which still has to be retained? The mother said that the only one emotion is worth retaining, and that is the emotion of love, the feeling of love, and it should be reserved for only one, that is the divine. So only one feeling and reserved for only one, the divine. That doesn't mean that you don't have to love people or animals or plants, but then you are loving them because you see in them the divine. You see the divine in them, so you're loving the divine in them. You're not loving them because of their outer form. You're loving them because of their essence. So that is the type of feeling which is worth retaining. And eventually, as one progresses on the path, this is what it should lead to. It's a type of austerity, the minimum, living on the minimum, feeling the minimum. So that minimum is the emotion of love and reserving it for the divine and the divine in its creation. Suggested reading these two textbooks. There's not much of it in that popular book, Human Machine, but these two textbooks have something, particularly this Understanding Medical Physiology, that goes into considerable length in both the physiological as well as some spiritual aspects of emotions. Uh, Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place where I live and work, and from where I'm speaking, and to which post-COVID, now you're most welcome. We are back to normal with all our usual activities. We'll have time for questions at the end of the session, but if you have further questions or any comments, please drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for listening and watching.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mukund.
Sir, I have a question. It's not actually a question, but it is just the my feeling. What I feel is, how is it possible to make our intellect uh, uh, or our rationality emotion oriented and emotions rationality oriented? Is it possible? And is it can it be a second choice? Because sometimes, every time we may not get the voice of the inner psychic being, or sometimes we tend to ignore it also because our intellect is too strong and it gives us a wrong pathway. That also can happen. So how is it, can we be emotionally rational and rationally emotional? Is that a
Yes, that's a good question. That is exactly what unification is about. That is the emotional part of the being, the intellect and the psychic being becoming one. Then that distinction in a way is lost. And that is how the emotions also become psychic being oriented. The intellect also becomes psychic being oriented. And in that sense, that is lost. So that's why if you ask a person when he does something right, even if it appeared wrong at the intellectual level, how did you decide to do it? The person says, I did it from my heart. The heart can refer to the soul, the heart can refer to emotions, because at that point, the distinction had been lost.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes.
All right, if there are no more questions, then we close today's session. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. Yes, for regarding that question about the link for the practical session, you will find the playlist on the YouTube channel, and I'll just message the link in a moment. Thank you, everyone.